when 41-year-old Maria Gonzalez stepped onto the Family Feud stage wearing the crisp blue vest of a grocery store cashier. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. But when she answered, realizing you're stronger than you ever imagined, to a question about the scariest thing about starting over, she began sharing a story that would remind everyone watching that sometimes life's greatest devastations become the doorways to discovering who we really are. Maria moved with the careful confidence of someone who had learned to navigate an entirely new world in the span of 18 months. There was something immediately compelling about her presence, not because her story was tragic, but because she radiated the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from being forced to reinvent yourself completely and discovering that you're capable of far more than you ever believed possible. The Gonzalez family had made the journey from Phoenix, Arizona, with a mixture of pride and amazement at how dramatically their lives had changed since losing the man who had been their anchor for over 20 years. There was Miguel Gonzalez, 17, Maria's oldest son, a senior in high school who had watched his mother transform from a grieving widow into a working woman with quiet strength and determination. His younger siblings had come as well. Sophia, 15, a sophomore who had become Maria's closest confidant and biggest supporter as they navigated their new reality together. And Diego, who had struggled most with his father's death, but had found stability in watching his mother create structure and security from complete uncertainty. Maria's sister, Carmen, 38, had also made the trip, the woman who had held the family together during those first devastating months, who had taught Maria how to pay bills, how to interview for jobs, how to fill out forms and navigate systems that had been completely foreign to someone who had spent 20 years focused exclusively on home and family. But it was Maria herself who commanded attention, not because she was remarkable for working as a grocery store cashier, but because she approached her work with the same dedication and pride that she had once brought to maintaining her household, because she wore her uniform with the dignity of someone who understood that all honest work has value. Maria had been 19 when she married Carlos Gonzalez, 20 when Miguel was born, and completely devoted to creating a home where her husband could focus on his construction business while she managed everything related to their children's education, health, and development. For 20 years she had been the family's anchor, the one who remembered appointments, managed schedules, maintained relationships with teachers and coaches, and neighbors. Carlos had been not just her husband but her entire framework for understanding how the world worked. He had handled all the finances, all the business decisions, all the interactions with banks and insurance companies and government agencies. Maria had been content to focus on the parts of family life that felt natural to her, the nurturing, the organizing, the endless details of keeping 3 children healthy, happy, and on track toward productive futures. The heart attack had been sudden and massive. Carlos had been 42 years old, in seemingly good health, with no warning signs that anyone had recognized. One Tuesday morning he had kissed Maria goodbye as he left for work, and by that evening he was gone, leaving behind a family that had never imagined they would have to function without him. The first months after Carlos's death had been devastating in ways that went far beyond grief. Maria had discovered that she didn't know how to pay the mortgage, didn't understand their insurance policies, had never written a check or balanced a budget, or dealt with any of the practical realities that kept their household functioning. She had been forced to learn not just how to live without her husband, but how to exist as an independent adult in ways she had never needed to develop. The financial situation had been dire. Carlos's construction business had died with him, and while there was some life insurance, it wasn't nearly enough to maintain their lifestyle or even their housing without additional income. Maria had realized that she would need to find work, but she had no job experience, no professional skills, no understanding of how to present herself as a candidate for employment. The decision to apply for a cashier position at the local grocery store had been both humbling and terrifying. At 40 years old, Maria had found herself competing for entry-level positions with teenagers, trying to convince managers that despite having no work history, she could learn quickly and contribute meaningfully to their operations. The first few months of work had been overwhelming. Maria had needed to learn not just the technical aspects of operating a cash register and managing customer transactions, but the entire culture of workplace expectations, showing up on time, following procedures, dealing with difficult customers, working as part of a team rather than as the independent manager of her own household. But gradually, Maria had discovered that many of the skills she had developed as a mother and household manager were directly applicable to her new role. Her ability to multitask, to remain calm under pressure, to communicate clearly with people from all walks of life, to solve problems creatively, all of these capacities that she had taken for granted in her domestic life proved to be valuable professional assets. More importantly, Maria had begun to discover aspects of herself that had been dormant during her years of complete focus on family. She found that she enjoyed interacting with customers, that she was good at training new employees, that she had opinions about workplace efficiency and customer service, that her supervisors valued and implemented. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Miguel's suggestion, born from his observation that his mother had become someone new over the past year and a half. Not different from who she had been, but more complete, incorporating aspects of herself that had never had opportunities for expression during her years as a full-time wife and mother. Maria had been hesitant, initially. The thought of appearing on national television as a grocery store cashier felt exposing, potentially embarrassing. She was still adjusting to her new identity as a working woman, still sometimes surprised by her own competence and confidence in professional settings. But her children had convinced her that her story mattered, not as inspiration for other widows but as evidence that women are capable of reinventing themselves at any age. That strength often emerges in response to circumstances that initially feel impossible to navigate. Steve Harvey had been briefed about Maria's background during rehearsal, but meeting her in person revealed layers of grace and resilience that couldn't be captured in a production note. There was something immediately impressive about her presence, not because her story was dramatic, but because she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven to herself that she could handle whatever life presented. Maria, Steve had said during the family introductions, "Tell us what you do for work." "I'm a cashier at Fry's grocery store." Maria had replied clearly, her voice carrying the pride of someone who had earned the right to claim any professional identity through her own efforts. "I've been working there for about a year and a half now." "And how do you like it?" Steve had asked, genuinely curious about her experience in a job that many people would consider entry-level. "I love it," Maria had replied with obvious sincerity. "I get to meet people from all over the community, help them with their shopping, make their day a little easier. It's rewarding work." The game had progressed through 3 rounds, with the Gonzalez family showing remarkable chemistry despite the dramatic changes their household had undergone. Maria had contributed thoughtful answers, her responses revealing both practical wisdom gained through experience and the kind of emotional intelligence that comes from navigating significant life transitions. When asked to name something that teaches you patience, she had confidently answered, "Raising teenagers, earning the number 2 spot on the board and knowing laughter from parents in the audience." But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The question touched the heart of human resilience and personal transformation. What's the scariest thing about starting over? The competing family had just missed their opportunity to control the board, and it was the Gonzalez family's chance to steal. Miguel had given the first answer, not knowing what to expect, which had earned a solid spot on the board. Sophia had followed with "being alone," another respectable response that reflected her generation's understanding of independence and self-reliance. Now it was Maria's turn. She stepped forward to the podium, and for a moment she was quiet, not uncertain, but gathering herself to express something that touched the core of her journey over the past 18 months, the truth that had sustained her through the most challenging period of her life. When she spoke, her voice carried across the studio with a conviction that made everyone listen. "Realizing you're stronger than you ever imagined." The words hung in the air with a weight that seemed to silence the entire studio. The audience fell quiet, sensing that this wasn't just a survey response, but a deeply personal revelation shared by someone who had discovered hidden reserves of capability and courage. Steve's expression changed immediately. The entertainer's smile, the quick wit, the practiced responses, all of it fell away as he processed what Maria had just said and began to understand the profound journey it represented. Maria, Steve said softly, setting down his cards and approaching her. That sounds like you're speaking from experience. Maria nodded, her confidence growing as she realized she had an opportunity to share something important with an audience much larger than the customers she served at the grocery store. I am, she replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through complete transformation. A year and a half ago, my husband Carlos passed away suddenly. He was 42, and I had never worked outside the home, never even written a check. I thought I couldn't survive without him. Steve looked at this remarkable woman, who was describing one of life's most devastating experiences with the calm composure of someone who had not just survived, but had discovered new dimensions of herself in the process. Maria, Steve said gently, what was it like to realize you had to learn how to do everything on your own? Maria took a moment to consider the question, clearly comfortable discussing her journey, but wanting to convey the complexity of her experience accurately. It was terrifying at first, she said honestly. I didn't know how to pay bills, how to talk to insurance companies, how to apply for jobs. I felt like I was completely unprepared for the world. She paused, looking at her children, drawing strength from their obvious support and pride. But then I started learning, and I discovered that I was capable of things I never knew I could do. Getting my first job, managing our finances, taking care of my children on my own. Every time I figured out something new, I realized I was stronger than I had ever believed. Steve nodded, impressed by Maria's ability to frame devastating loss as an opportunity for self-discovery, to find growth within tragedy, without minimizing the difficulty of her journey. And what's it been like working outside the home for the first time? Steve asked. Maria's face lit up with obvious enthusiasm as she began discussing the subject that had become central to her new identity. It's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, she said with genuine warmth. At first, I was embarrassed to be starting as a cashier at 40 years old, working alongside teenagers who had more job experience than I did. The studio was completely quiet now, everyone understanding that they were hearing from someone who had successfully navigated one of life's most challenging transitions. But I discovered that all the skills I had developed as a mother and wife, multitasking, problem-solving, communicating with different kinds of people, staying calm under pressure, all of that experience was valuable in my job. I wasn't starting from zero. I was bringing 20 years of life experience to my work. Steve looked at this extraordinary woman who had transformed personal tragedy into professional growth, who had found ways to honor both her grief and her emerging independence. Maria, Steve said, what do you want people to understand about starting over later in life? Maria straightened, revealing the woman who had emerged from circumstances that could have defeated her. I want them to know that you're never too old to discover new things about yourself, she said with growing confidence. I spent 20 years thinking that I was just a wife and mother, that I didn't have anything to offer the outside world. But when I was forced to work, I found out that I'm good at customer service, that I'm reliable, that I can learn new skills and contribute to a team. She looked at her children, then back at Steve. I want people to understand that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become doorways to discovering who we really are. I wouldn't choose to lose Carlos, but I'm grateful for who I've become since his death. I'm stronger, more independent, more confident than I ever was before. Steve realized he was looking at someone who had redefined her entire identity not through choice but through necessity, and had discovered in the process that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Maria, Steve said, I want everyone in this studio to understand what we just heard. You didn't just survive losing your husband, you discovered who you are when you're forced to rely on yourself. The audience began to react, not with pity or sympathy for her loss, but with genuine respect and admiration for someone who had transformed devastating circumstances into personal empowerment. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something unexpected, his car keys, a simple key ring, that had become symbolic of independence and mobility for someone who had built his career from nothing. "Maria," Steve said, approaching her with the gravity of someone recognizing true achievement, "these are the keys to my independence. For decades, they've represented my ability to go wherever I need to go, to take care of myself and my family, to create opportunities rather than wait for them." He placed the keys gently in Maria's hands. "But I want you to have them, because you've shown me what real independence looks like. Not the independence of someone who never needed help, but the independence of someone who learned to help herself when she had no other choice." Maria accepted the keys with obvious emotion, understanding both the symbolic weight of the gesture and the recognition it represented. "But I want to do something else," Steve continued. He began removing his suit jacket, the same navy blue jacket he wore for every taping. "Maria," Steve said, draping the jacket carefully around her shoulders, "you're not starting over. You're starting strong. You're not beginning from weakness. You're building from the foundation of everything you learned during 20 years of managing a household and raising children." The jacket fit Maria perfectly, and she wore it with the dignity of someone receiving recognition for genuine achievement. "This jacket has been with me for every show I've hosted this season," Steve continued. "But today it belongs to someone who's taught me that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about discovering what you're made of when you're forced to get back up." Maria looked down at the jacket, then at Steve, overwhelmed by the recognition and the validation that the gesture represented. "Steve," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for the past year and a half I've been worried that people would see me as a failure, a woman who couldn't keep her family together, who had to start over at 40. You're the first person to suggest that starting over might actually be a victory." Steve looked at this extraordinary woman who had turned forced independence into chosen empowerment, who had discovered that strength often emerges in response to circumstances we never wanted to face. "Maria," Steve said, "you didn't fail at anything. You succeeded at the hardest thing anyone can do. You rebuilt your life from scratch and discovered that you're capable of taking care of yourself and your children without anyone else's help." He turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, Maria Gonzalez represents something beautiful about human resilience, the ability to discover our own strength when life takes away everything we thought we needed to feel secure." The audience erupted in sustained applause, but this time it felt more like a graduation ceremony than a game show moment. Recognition of personal achievement and transformation that transcended entertainment. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something remarkable happened. Person after person approached Maria, not to express sympathy for her loss, but to thank her for her example, to share their own stories of late-life career changes, to express admiration for her courage in rebuilding her life. One middle-aged woman approached with tears in her eyes. "I've been married for 22 years and I've never worked," she told Maria. "My husband isn't dead, but our marriage might be ending, and I've been terrified about supporting myself. Watching you today, seeing your confidence, you've shown me that I might be stronger than I think." 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional weight of Maria's story or Steve's unprecedented gesture. The response was immediate and profound. Career counseling services reported increases in inquiries from older women seeking to enter the workforce for the first time. The episode became a training tool for programs designed to help people transition from unemployment to economic independence. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other widows and women facing late-life independence, who saw in Maria's story proof that devastating loss doesn't have to mean permanent defeat, that it's possible to discover new aspects of yourself at any age. Maria returned to her job at Fry's with renewed confidence and expanded opportunities. Steve's gesture had given her not just material support but symbolic validation that her work mattered, that her journey was worthy of recognition and respect. She kept Steve's keys as a daily reminder that independence is earned through action rather than granted through circumstance. The jacket became the blazer she wore to job interviews when she was promoted to customer service supervisor 6 months later. Miguel, Sophia, and Diego learned from watching their mother that resilience isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about discovering what you're capable of when hardship finds you. They saw her transform from someone who depended on others for basic life management to someone who could handle whatever challenges presented themselves. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that meeting Maria changed his understanding of strength, independence, and what it means to start over. She taught me that the question isn't whether you can survive losing everything you thought you needed, he said. The question is whether you're brave enough to discover who you are when you're forced to rely on yourself. The lesson that day wasn't about overcoming tragedy or inspiring others through adversity. It was about the truth that human beings are capable of far more than they realize. That strength often lies dormant until circumstances force it to emerge, and that sometimes the most devastating losses become opportunities to discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. Maria Gonzalez proved that starting over isn't about going backward. It's about going deeper, about accessing reserves of strength and competence that were always present but never needed. She showed that independence isn't about never needing help. It's about learning to help yourself when help isn't available. And Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen when you recognize not what someone has lost, but what they have found, not their weakness in the face of tragedy, but their strength in response to circumstances they never chose but handled with grace, courage, and the kind of quiet dignity that emerges when we discover we're capable of far more than we ever imagined.